Hello and welcome to Farmland. As we get back to a more familiar and normal way of life following COVID-19 restrictions, in this programme we'll take you along the journey to the United Arab Emirates, where the Minister for Agriculture, Charlie McConalogue, recently led a Board Bia trade mission to look for new markets. Also in this programme, I'll be joined in studio by our panellists Richard Halleron and Ciaran Fitzgerald to discuss rising input costs and inflation. But first, the new Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP as it's known, has been signed into law for 2027. I'm joined now in studio by MEP for the Midlands North West, Colm Markey, a farmer himself, to discuss CAP and the impact on family farms in Ireland. MEP Markey, Colm, thank you for joining us on Farmland. First of all, Colm, can you tell me what you feel has been the outcome of the latest CAP negotiations in terms of family farms in Ireland?
Well, I suppose the big change with CAP versus previous CAPs is that whole drive towards the environmental agenda and the like of eco schemes. That would be on one side, and I suppose the other big element of it is the whole area of convergence, where, if you like, the payments are being levelled out, and I suppose in that scenario, obviously enough, there will be winners and losers. And I suppose it means that certain parts of the country where maybe would have had a historic high profile in terms of productivity probably are going to lose a bit, and other areas are going to gain. So that may, I suppose, has always been a point of contention, I suppose, among farmers, that like it has the capacity to divide one farmer against the other. And that's obviously a concern that's there. I think that alongside the idea of the eco schemes, and I suppose the eco schemes are going to bring a new challenge, and in themselves also bring a certain amount of convergence, because there'll be a similar payment no matter where you are in the country or what your farming style is for your eco payment. So that'll be a flat element of a payment. So all that's going to move the figures around a little, and it will impact some farmers positively and some farmers negatively. And I think that obviously those who lose out will be concerned. And I suppose particularly in the like of a beef sector or some of the sectors that are more challenged, it may put a little bit of pressure on in terms of viability, and I think that would be one of the concerns.
And could we have got a better deal from Europe?
Well, I think if you look at the overall package, initially, before we'll say the whole COVID scenario came into play, there was talk of a 17% cut in the CAP. By virtue of the Green Deal or the effort to reinvest into Europe, there was additional funding found that brought that margin back to, I think it's 2 or 3% of a cut so in terms of the overall package, I think we've done quite well to hold on to what we've had. I think the one concern I'd have about that is that's for the period of this CAP, but in the next round of CAP, that's, if you like, a temporary gap that's filled. Whether we'll be in a position to fill that gap in 5 years' time is a concern, and I think that's one of the things that would be a concern about it. I think equally within the eco schemes, we have to make sure the eco schemes are available and flexible for farmers to take advantage of. I know initially there was only 5 eco schemes put on the table here in Ireland, and there was a number of additional ones which I think was very welcome. Like, all that's going to the Commission now for review, and this 12 months essentially of this year to review that. And the suggestion is there will be like dialogue with them in the department in terms of where that's at. I suppose Ireland, in fairness, was one of the countries who got their strategic plan in on time, whereas a number of countries, I think 6 or 7 of them, and some significant countries within that, didn't. And whether that'll have any impact or not, I don't know. But certainly the convergence is going to be something that'll be relevant to farmers on the ground. The eco schemes are, and I suppose the other thing that's there is a drive towards organics. Now the funding towards organics is increased 5-fold. There's a European ambition to get 25% of land to be organic. Now, in an Irish context, when you're only on a couple of percent, that's an enormous difference. But we challenged the Commissioner on that at the time, and he said, well, that's a European target. It's not a national target.
And Colm, you mentioned there that we did well to hold on to, I suppose, the overall funding package for the CAP up to 2027, given that they were mentioning a 17% reduction. But with the oncoming regulations that are coming in terms of climate action, 2030 and 2050 and so on, Was it not, I suppose, short-sighted of the EU in that sense then, if they wanted to bring all of these extra climate action measures in and they only still maintained the same CAP funding, despite all of these new environmental measures going to be costing farmers a lot more to implement?
There's, if you like, two elements to this whole scenario going forward. There's what farmers have traditionally done to get the CAP. It was, if you like, it was a support towards productivity, and it was certain requirements in terms of environmental standards. It's straightforward things that were doing on the farm. There is a whole additional level of what is probably coming down the tracks in terms of environmental responsibility. But then there's the whole conversation about carbon farming. And I think we have to be very clear that carbon farming doesn't get subsumed into the CAP, because ultimately it'll be more work for the same money. And what we have to make sure is that carbon farming stands alone, and the ambition in terms of reducing, obviously sequestering carbon, but equally reducing other greenhouse gases and other even biodiversity measures for what they call an enhanced carbon credit. We cannot allow a conversation to develop that allows that just fall in under the CAP as eco schemes. And I think that's the key thing. There needs to be, and in fairness to the Commission, they accepted, and we challenged DG Climate, they accepted this is a different revenue stream, this is an alternative scenario. It involves bringing private money in as well, so it has to be a different beast, a different vehicle. And I think that's so important, because if we don't do that, you'll end up just what you're saying. We don't end up in a situation where farmers are being asked to do more and more for the same money. This is an alternative stream of income that has to be established and not just be subsumed under the CAP.
That is a great idea, and it's idealistic, but in terms of carbon sequestration, particularly in Ireland, are we just playing catch up here? It doesn't seem that the likes of Teagasc have enough information yet, or have enough data or research done on this. We seem to be on the back foot in terms of the data that we do have on this, to try and catch up and make it a credible and viable way of trading credits for the farming community.
I wouldn't altogether agree in that. I certainly the information is not there at the moment, but I don't think Ireland is particularly far behind other countries on this. I think in fact Ireland will be recognised as one of the 3 or 4 countries most advanced in terms of the work they've done. A lot of work has been done in the last 18 months or 2 years in terms of trying to put, I suppose, indicative figures, number one, but then put the science behind the figures of what carbon can be sequestered and what mitigate. The other thing is what carbon can be retained in the soil and on peatland soils as well. So there's a lot of work gone into that in recent times, and certainly from talking at European level, Ireland is no further behind everyone else, and it is going to be a couple of years before that if you like, that the science is on the ground, and also the legislation, the framework at European level is on the ground. The fear I'd have is that we get too far ahead in CAP without giving recognition and expecting people to do more for the same. I think that's what we have to avoid, that we have to make sure that we get the timing of this right, that the efforts that farmers made, that they get recognition for them, that if they're going to make changes and it's going to impact on their farming, that they get recognition as part of that. And if we, like, eco schemes are very important, and they will make some changes, but the level of investment that's going to be required from farmers is going to require more money, and I think that has to be. We have to get the timing of this right. I wouldn't say that Ireland is particularly behind. I've checked out where other countries are at in Europe, and in fairness, a lot of work that has been done in recent times, particularly by Teagasc and indeed by other private sector operators as well, in terms of profiling what's on the ground, in terms of identifying what carbon is sequestered by grassland and hedgerows, and equally what's been emitted from our peatlands. And the suggestion is that some of those figures are going to change and maybe be not as negative as they are currently being presented.
Now, just to draw your attention to another very controversial issue recently, and I suppose it's quite topical in the sense of both sides of the argument in terms of the welfare of animals during transport. Now, I know that yourself and indeed MEP Billy Kelleher were involved in this debate in Europe. There was a lot of concern at the time about the impact that legislation, when it was initially proposed, could have had on the live export trade from Ireland. How important is it that we keep that trade going, and what are your thoughts on the welfare of animals that we do transport from Ireland?
I think there was a lot of work done in a year and a half in relation to this. Certainly, in all the time I was there, I focused particularly on it. Got some speakers here from Ireland to explain what was happening in Ireland. And the one strong thing that came out of it was that across all of Europe, it was recognised in a lot of cases that Ireland was actually the best practice, particularly in the transport of the like of calves and that Ireland had best practice across all of Europe in terms of how they, in compliance with regulations and in terms of the standards were there. Even those who were opposed to the animal transport recognised the standards that there was in Ireland. So that's the first place we have to start from. I think secondary to that, when you do look into the stats and the figures and that, like the story from Ireland actually is quite a good story. And what our concern all the time was to bring the people who weren't up to the standard, rather than setting ever higher standards for the people who are trying to get the thing right to comply with. And that's why we pushed so hard against some of the measures that were proposed. And some of them, frankly, wouldn't have worked. Like there was a proposal where you had to keep calves on farm to 5 weeks, but not so much that it was 5 weeks, but from there you could move them to holding centres until such time they were weaned. And to me that was just didn't make sense. Anyone who's practical experience of farming level, if you take calves from farms, you pool them together and you put them in one location, that leads to disease issues, it leads to health and welfare problems. We have an antimicrobial resistance challenge there, or antibiotic resistance challenge there. This would only make that 10 times worse. So personally, I drove very hard against that for the very reason that I actually found it. I put it to the people that actually what they were proposing, it was a last minute amendment that was put in right at the end. It was not thought out, and it wasn't thought out by people with practical experience of the agricultural industry.
Colm Markey, MEP, thank you very much for joining us today. Recently, Minister for Agriculture Charlie McConalogue led a Board BIA trade mission to the Gulf region to try and develop new markets. Agriland also flew to the UAE with the delegation to see what the mission was all about.
It's a very important market, and indeed the whole region here in the Middle East is an important region. So last year, for example, we exported 55 million worth of product to the UAE. That's mainly dairy and also prepared consumer foods, and there's lots more opportunity. Now, part of that reason is that here in the UAE, and particularly in Dubai where we are, it's a very sophisticated consumer who is here. We've a lot of expatriates who are here, and so they really like to see brands that they feel that they can trust. And Irish brands are pretty well known here at this stage, and consumers do trust them. Gulf Food is a really important fair, and I suppose we have to put it in the context as well of the last 2 years of a pandemic where we haven't been able to be at these physical trade shows. Now, it's not only the Middle East customers who come here, but it's customers from Asia, from Africa as well who come here, and we have 14 companies on the Board BIA stand that are displaying their produce there for buyers to come and see. And you'll see that it's a mixture of people reconnecting with existing suppliers because they haven't been able to meet them face to face, and that's really important in terms of building the relationship. But also other new buyers will come along, so they'll get to make first contact with people.
90% of the food that is produced on family farms right across the country is exported and goes to markets such as the Gulf region here and indeed 180 countries across the world. While farmers do massive work in terms of producing, whether it's beef, dairy, sheep, the many meats that we produce, it's essential that we actually have plates and customers which they land on and people that are buying that food. The key objective behind missions such as this is to ensure that we're developing markets for it, also to ensure that the massive quality that we have in terms of the food we're producing, the grass-based production system we have, which is quite unique across the world, that we communicate that to customers here, that we try and build on the relationships we have and grow the market, but also get new customers, and really importantly, try and maximise the value for the food that we're producing. So, for example, the Origin Green story that we have to tell, and the reality that very much is how we produce, the quality assurance which so many farmers take part in, and that tremendous care and attention that farmers give to producing quality food.
I'm joined now in studio by Agriland columnist and agri-economist Ciaran Fitzgerald, and indeed also Richard Halleron, Agriland journalist. And today we're going to be talking about the rising cost of food prices on a global scale, Ciaran, and indeed input costs for farmers on the ground. First of all, Ciaran, let me go to inflation. Inflation is rising, as we know, globally at the moment, particularly in the US, but also in Europe. What impact will food pricing have on agri-production here in Ireland, for example?
Yeah, I think if you look at the most recent consumer price index figures, food prices have gone up by 1%. So in terms of a general increase in inflation, I think the latest figures are nearly 6%. Food hasn't had much of a contribution, and I think that goes to a 20-year policy, unfortunately, where food pricing has become disconnected from the cost of producing food. So on the one hand, in commodity markets, I think we can expect better returns because commodity markets actually work at a level. But food pricing reflects the policy of food retailers. In recent years, the discounters, but also the supermarkets. So unfortunately, we have a fairly chronic situation where over a long period of time, a lot of fresh food is sold at or below cost. So, you know, on the one hand, in commodity markets, yes, better return. There has to be a reflection of the greater cost of inputs in terms of pricing at retail level. There is a need for change. There needs to be legislation brought in, actually, that prevents food from being sold below cost.
And Ciaran, whose responsibility is that then? I mean, we seem to see that there is a disconnect between the advertisements we see on the television, which say, I now shop here, this is how much I have saved on my weekly shop, versus the farmers and their families who are out on picket lines and demonstration lines outside retailers saying, we cannot produce this potato, we cannot produce this, you know, slice of pork for the below cost, you know, price that it's being sold for.
Yeah, I mean, you know, just to give you a figure on that, because there's a recent publication by the CSO looks at food inflation and inflation in general in Ireland going back to 2010. And while the cost of living has gone up 8%, the cost of food has gone down 10%. So the real, if you like, inflation impact has been minus 18%. So it's a chronic situation and it needs to be addressed by legislation. The responsibility, unfortunately, rests between two departments. It's sort of, because the consumer piece of it is with the Department of Enterprise and the production piece of it is with the Department of Ag. And the Department of Enterprise have taken a view, which is the view of competition authorities, that the interests of consumers are best reflected in the interests of the retailers. And I would argue that they've actually made a fundamental misconception here in terms of assuming that if the retailer is in charge of things, that all the benefits of low pricing or loss leading are passed back to the consumer. They're not. And again, you know, just a little bit of detail, grocery pricing is probably the only type of pricing where you got multiple prices and multiple products bought. So on average, you're buying maybe between 80 and 100 products. You know, research has shown people are very price sensitive on between 5 and 10 of those, which might be the fresh food and fresh veg we talked about. Those products are sold at or below cost. The retailer recovers margin on the other 95, so the retailer is okay. Unfortunately, the supplier of fresh products is getting no return, and over a long period of time, this becomes a chronic situation. So it needs legislative change. The Department of Enterprise is responsible for the Consumer Council and for consumer pricing. But it needs a push from the Department of Agriculture that sort of relates to the fact that you can't have a disconnect over 20 years between the cost of producing something and the price of it.
Richard, you would agree, I think, that commodity prices are good at the moment. That benefits, I suppose, agriculture. What do you feel is the feeling on the ground with the Farmgate price?
Well, as we speak, in the here and now, I think farming is in a pretty good place. Farmers are reasonably happy with their lot. We're looking towards 2022. We've come off the back of a 2021 that pretty much ticked every box. The weather played fair for us. We had a great harvest. We had a tremendous grass growing year. We had a tremendous harvest plus grain prices at all-time high levels. All of the key commodity prices as we came to the end of 2021 were all extremely positive. Milk, beef, lamb, I mentioned grain. So we've got that base to work from as we look towards 2022. Yes, there's a lot of talk at the moment about the increase in fertiliser prices, the increase in grain feed prices. That is a reality. But if you look at it from the other side of the production equation, farmers will see, I believe, a relatively strong period of prices coming at them, certainly into 2022. Look, I'm old enough to remember when farmers were coming under pressure at both ends of the system. Strong commodity prices and strong input prices in terms of what they're paying at the Farmgate to grow the crops, to grow the grass, but also being, coming under pressure, real pressure, in terms of the milk price that was available to them, the beef price that was available to them, the lamb price. So yes, I hear what people say about fertiliser prices and energy prices and the input side of it strengthening at the moment, but it's not all. It's by no means it's not all bad news.
And you have mentioned a couple of times as well, I suppose, in your articles, Richard, the climate measures that farming in Ireland will have to implement over the next number of years to try and meet our climate targets, something Ciaran has often touched on himself. Do you feel that farmers are on board to do this?
I think in principle farming as an industry, it recognises two things. Number one, we're part of the problem, but we're also part of the solution. I think farmers, in that general sense, are very much up for a drive into the future and looking at improving their efficiency. I mean, there is a clear link between improved efficiency and reducing the carbon footprint of your business. That's fact. That's taken as fact. And there will be a tremendous focus on that very issue over the next 10, 20 years into the future. But what farmers will not be up for is any linkage between the output coming off their farms and emission levels. I think that's going to be a big, that there will be a major discussion, debate on that particular point over the next, well, it's already starting.
Ciaran, to bring you in on this one as well, one of our biggest exports is dairy and our dairy products. The Food Vision Dairy Group has now been established, and I suppose the rumour or the talk was, could this be the reintroduction of milk quotas to Ireland? Now, of course, the chair of this particular group, the former Teagasc director, Professor Jerry Boyle, has said that's not on his agenda. The minister said he's not looking to reduce dairy output. But what sort of impact would that have on our economy and what agriculture contributes to our economic outlook if dairy was in any way to be curtailed or stayed at what it is?
I think the reality is, if you look at the carbon budgets that have been set, and if you look at the legislation, there is a cap, and we're in a phase now where emissions have to be, emission increases have to be stabilised and they have to be reduced. So if you take stabilisation first and then reduction, the question really is, how is that implemented in a way that doesn't totally impact on productivity, say? So up to 2015, we produced 5 billion litres of milk. Last year, we produced 9 billion. The contribution to the Irish economy has been phenomenal. I think if you look at it in terms of Irish economy expenditure, there's now over €1.5 billion spent every year in the Irish economy, more because of milk quotas being abolished and increase in milk production that wasn't there before. That is a huge contribution because it all goes back into the Irish economy. It buys Irish goods and there's a huge multiplier effect. Now, if we look at the imperative of the climate change piece and we say we have to reduce emissions, what we have to look at, as well as the technical aspects of that and the huge cost of that, is in the first instance, we're foregoing further economic opportunity. And that's not easily forgone. So growth has given us economic impact. So, we're walking away from that if we put a cap. So we really have to look at a measure that applies this reduction in emissions in such a way that you don't kill off productivity.
Richard, would you say that there has been a mischaracterization of agriculture in Ireland? Do you think there is a disconnect between the consumer, you and I suppose, that eat the food every day? Do you think there's a disconnect between the consumer and where the food comes from and what it takes to produce that food?
Total. I couldn't agree more with what Ciaran has just said. I mean, we can feed 25 million people as an industry, as a farming industry in this country. I mean, we've got to keep that to the forefront in terms of our thinking moving forward. The other key message that I feel has been lost totally in relation to the discussion, the debate on climate change is we are unique in the world, within the world, in being able to grow grass. It is our ace card in the pack. It is a tremendous asset that we have. Other countries around the world would give whatever to be able to do what we can do so naturally. Producing milk from grazed grass, producing beef from grazed grass, producing sheep from grazed grass. It's the most natural way to produce food, and yet I believe we fail miserably in communicating that very key point to the world.
Has Europe taken into account our unique position, A, as an island, and B, as an agricultural industry that predominantly is grass-based?
I don't think so. But I think that's an argument that we have to put back to Europe. It's an ongoing discussion. I think we're coming to the very end of the ongoing CAP review. One of the positives coming out of it for me is the fact that there will be more scope for Ireland as a nation to look at domestic funding opportunities for agriculture, more so than would have been the case in the day. I think genuinely Brussels now recognises that within a block of 27 member states, what happens within Bulgaria in terms of that country's agriculture is fundamentally different and will be different always relative to what we do in this country. So I think you're seeing the start of a recognition at Brussels, within the European Commission, that there must be more flexibility allowed in terms of how the common agricultural policy is delivered.
Richard, in terms finally of the dairy output of this country, which is I suppose primarily what we're focusing on at the moment now, I know there will be these food vision committees for other sectors as well, but what sort of message do you think that's sending out to the dairy industry? Can you see processors becoming involved in this where they are putting limits on supply? Can you see new entrants into dairy being disheartened or disillusioned? You know, generational renewal won't become a thing in dairy farms if they can't renew, if there's going to be some sort of restrictions on the industry.
Well, to answer your point directly, processors are already involved with this group that met for the first time earlier this week. Farmers are very concerned that out of this will come some form of proposal that will formally link milk output with emission reduction targets. But to come back to I think the fundamental point in terms of where we're going and farmers' perception of the way they feel they've been treated within this environmental debate at the moment. One of the big issues that they find it very, very hard to deal with is there seems to be, there is no recognition as yet in terms of the actual carbon sequestration that is taking place on farms, on every farm in this country, courtesy of the soils that the farmers are managing, their hedgerows, their trees. We have yet to get a figure in terms of what that sequestration level is, and that has not been factored into the debate in any real sense at all. And farmers, I feel, are justifiably angry about that because, as I said, they're up for a deal. They want to bring the carbon footprint of agriculture down. Of that, there's no doubt. They are up for the deal. They see what's coming down the track. They know they have got to address this issue. But they want it on the basis of let's have a fair and equitable starting point. That's not there at the moment.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for joining us, Richard Halleron, and indeed Ciaran Fitzgerald. And thanks to you for watching this episode of Farmland. Remember, you can keep up to date on the latest agri news on the Agriland website and the Agriland app. And be sure to follow us on the following links.